We live in an age of boundless opportunity with unprecedented levels of social, economic and scientific advancement. So why do millions of people still suffer from the never-ending cycle of man-made and natural violence? In 2002 alone, more than 600 million people were struck by natural disasters. Disasters can destroy years of development in minutes. They seek out the poor and make sure they remain so. Without access to water, food, healthcare and education, people are more vulnerable to disease, disaster and armed conflict. More and more civilians bear the brunt of indiscriminate and deliberate attacks, and terrorism creates a vicious cycle of violence. A growing number of people endure injury, mutilation, abduction, and forced displacement. The whereabouts of hundreds of thousands of people are still unknown. The protection of human dignity is not an abstract concept. The Red Cross Red Crescent movement takes concrete actions and engages in long-term initiatives to promote sustainable development and mitigate suffering. Yet humanitarian workers are nowadays at particular risk. They're even targeted directly, as recent events have shown. Our very ability to protect human dignity is at stake, despite our constant efforts to intervene swiftly and universally. The collapse of states and social structures further undermine the work of the Red Cross Red Crescent. The effective protection of the civilian population is the responsibility of states parties to the Geneva Conventions and armed groups. Protecting human dignity in armed conflict requires an unequivocal commitment from states and armed groups to respect and ensure respect for international humanitarian law. Are we heading in the right direction? The spread of weapons increasingly puts civilians at risk. This should come as no surprise, since in many parts of the world it's easier to arm yourself than feed yourself. If civilians are to be protected from armed violence, some fundamental questions need to be addressed. What leads people to arm themselves? How can we reduce vulnerability to armed violence? Part of the answer lies in strict and comprehensive rules that could save lives. Abandoned and unexploded munitions remove limbs and lives long after a conflict is over. Authorities must be responsible for clearing up these lethal remnants of war and for giving technical assistance to demining organisations. The Red Cross and Red Crescent would like to see an end to the use of submunitions against military targets in or near civilian settlements. What of the quest for new and more deadly weapons technologies? History shows that many scientific advances have been turned to hostile use. Advances in biotechnology could be used to deliberately spread disease or alter life processes with previously unimaginable consequences for humanity. The Red Cross Red Crescent calls upon scientists, business and politicians to work together in building a web of prevention against the misuse of biotechnology and to help ensure that science can only benefit humanity. Around the world, countless families continue their search for lost relatives. Where are they? Are they alive or dead? If they're not coming back alive, will families ever be able to know their fate and begin to grieve? Because of this uncertainty, ongoing feelings of injustice and resentment keep open the emotional wounds of war and shatter hope of reconciliation. Sadly, despite the work of the Red Cross Red Crescent, getting answers is often thwarted by a lack of political will. This is particularly true when people have disappeared as a result of violations of law, or where leaders have built their power out of hatred for another community. The Red Cross Red Crescent is strengthening its tracing operations to help bring answers and support to the families of the missing. But ultimately, the authorities are responsible for relieving the anguish of those still looking for answers. Breaches of international law trigger many forms of human suffering. The world now counts over 25 million people fleeing violence and persecution within their own countries. The plight of those living in the midst of forgotten conflicts usually goes unnoticed, and it's often exacerbated by terrorism and the fight against it. Countries in the headlines may get some help with their most urgent needs, but even then it can be to the detriment of long-term recovery and development. But amidst all the brutality, there is hope. The International Criminal Court and the International Tribunals for former Yugoslavia and Rwanda embody the international determination to end impunity. No state is above the law, and no person falls outside the protection of the law. The work of the International Criminal Court should send a strong message to all those who violate the law that they may now be held accountable for their actions. Natural disasters bring devastation everywhere, and the poorer you are, the harder they hit.
সব আছিল বাগান আছিল আম গাছ আছিল সুপারি গাছ আছিল পালে গরু আছিল তিনখান লাউ আছিল সব সকার এক খাবারে নিজে নিয়ে এইজন্য পথের ফহিনী হইছে
13 times more people die per disaster in the poorest countries. The fury of nature is exacerbated by the unwillingness to plan ahead, to reduce risk and push for sustainable development. Hazards don't have to become disasters. Investment in preparedness is more cost-effective than dealing with the consequences of disaster. In Vietnam, one of the most typhoon-lashed nations in Asia, the Red Cross has been planting mangrove forests on the north coast since 1994. The forests turn destructive waves into harmless ripples. Benefits are staggering. Not a single life was lost when Typhoon Wukong hit this protected area in 2000. Unfortunately, donors and most humanitarian actors still dedicate only meagre resources to risk reduction and disaster preparedness. When natural disasters strike, the most critical period is the first 48 hours. In many cases, the obligations of states are unclear, which can hamper instant access to victims. Humanitarian staff can be blocked at borders, waiting for a visa. Relief goods subjected to excessive custom processes. Restrictions are placed on communications equipment or landing rights. Led by the International Federation and national societies, the International Disaster Response Law Project seeks to improve the effectiveness of disaster response through existing law and by harmonizing legal frameworks. AIDS killed 3 million people in 2002. At this moment, Red Cross, Red Crescent volunteers and members are caring for people living with the effects of the virus and fighting stigma and discrimination. It's a fact where people have accurate knowledge about HIV and AIDS, there is less stigma and discrimination. Zuleika Abdullah is a Kenyan Red Cross volunteer. Herself infected, she recently started a new life by admitting her status and putting her energy into caring for people living with AIDS in her community. She's living proof of dignity.
I was HIV positive, and honestly, I was shocked. Being HIV, it doesn't mean death. Being HIV, it doesn't mean you have committed adultery. These drugs I used to take, I have to pay 7,000, 8,000. You see, where will we get money? We are poor, but being poor, it doesn't mean you have to die because you are poor. You could be unhappy. We are happy as a family.
AIDS is changing everything. Entire communities are slowly vanishing. The recent food security operation in southern Africa showed that providing starving people with food and agricultural items was necessary, but not enough. We're facing a new type of disaster in which AIDS, vulnerability, hunger and chronic poverty create a vicious circle. In AIDS-affected communities, the land stays idle. Heads of families are unable to pay school fees or put food on the table. When they die, the children have to fend for themselves. The fight against AIDS and hunger requires the joint implementation of food provision, agricultural support and other social safety net projects. Similar situations exist around the world where the widening gap between rich and poor, racism, discrimination and insufficient health programs force people out of their communities. States must ensure all people a minimum of protection and access to healthcare beyond emergency services. We need to help people regain and maintain their dignity. Today, the Red Cross Red Crescent mission to protect human dignity is more challenging than ever before. But the challenge is not ours alone. It will take a ceaseless and collective effort from governments, humanitarian partners, civil society and arms bearers. All those with the power to protect the most vulnerable in our societies. Only by using that power in favour of humanity will the world have a better future.